Welcome to the Pachehra Talks. In today's video, we are going to explore Azure AKS security. In our security specialist series, we are focusing on the security aspect, as the series says, or AZ500 says, rather than doing the administration and operation. So, without wasting any more time, just simply jump to the topic Azure AKS security. Okay. It will be more of a theoretical, but stay with me. We should know all these important points. We are going to talk about all those best practices that we should embrace or implement to secure our AKS cluster. So, as we manage a cluster in Azure or Azure Kubernetes service, workload and data security is our key consideration, right? Ultimately, because whatever we have or anyone is securing, they're securing data. At the core of everything is data, though we have multiple layers, as we already talked about in various other videos, like specifically defense in depth. So main is data or the workload that we are running to exchange that data or generate that data. So when we run multi-tenant clusters using logical isolation like namespaces, we especially need to secure resource and workload access first. And there are multiple best practices that we are going to talk about. So what we can do, we can minimize the risk of attack by applying the latest Kubernetes and Node OS security updates, the very basic thing. Anyways, let's start jumping on all those best practices. The very first is we need to enable. Here we are going to talk about all those practices, not absolutely foundation, but the practices which secure your AKS. I won't, though I've already mentioned like the latest version of Kubernetes so that you have all those bug fixes and updates, right? So let's go one by one. So the very first is we should enable the threat protection. And what is the threat protection? That threat protection is your MS Defender for containers. That is the threat protection I'm referring here. MS Defender for containers. Earlier they were like Defender for Kubernetes, Defender for this, Defender for that, but now everything is falling under containers. So we can enable Defender for containers to help secure our containers. Okay, then you will be thinking, what about pod? Well, everything falls under this. They're just calling it containers. So Defender for container can assess not only container but your cluster configuration and provide security recommendation. It can run vulnerability scans and provide real-time protection and alerting for your Kubernetes nodes and clusters and everything. We will go deeper into this aspect as well. Let's quickly go through all those practices that we should be aware of. Now, the second one is we need to secure the access to the API server and cluster node. Secure access. Access always comes first since the time cloud comes into the picture. The security aspect, the way we secure our environment is no more physical or perimeter oriented but the identity oriented. Hence the access and authorization is always comes first. You must have heard about the zero trust as well that we have talked about many times. One of those principle is least privileged principle, that is all about access. And the another principle is also access, like verify explicitly, that is again on the access. So secure access to the API server, of course, because everything is controlled through the API in the AKS. So we must secure API server. That's the head and cluster nodes, because they can access these nodes too. So that's why cluster nodes as well. So that's the second point. And how can we have multiple ways, like making the only limit the IP address which are accessing API, making it private, And then we have RBAC, Microsoft Entra ID. So there are multiple things. We will go in deep in each of these points in later in the video, or maybe in the upcoming if we couldn't cover in this one. Let's go to the third point. Third point is we need to restrict access to instance metadata. So what we need to do, we need to add network policy in our AKS, or maybe all the namespaces to block pod egress to the metadata point. Instance metadata service, which comes into the picture in the managed identity situation. All right, so we need to restrict that access to instance metadata API so that our pod cannot go ahead and have fun. All right, so the secure container access to the resources. Another point, we need to secure container access to resources. It is more or less same like here we are referring to pod because pod gets the MI or managed identity. Here we are referring to container access to the other resources. So we got to limit access to actions that containers can perform, provide the least number of permissions, and avoid the use of root access or privilege escalation. It will help in what was the third principle of zero trust? Blast radius, minimize the blast radius. All right, so another best practice is we should regularly update the latest version of Kubernetes. Regularly update the latest version of Kubernetes. Okay, update to the latest version of the Kubernetes. Why? Because to stay current on new features and bug fixes, regularly upgrade is the only choice that we have. Moreover, what I remember, Kubernetes releases two updates in an year. So, and they can support like I think n minus one or minus two. Well, that doesn't matter. You always go at least n minus one, if not the n, always to the latest version. So to have all those bug fixes and the new features that they release, continuously releasing. Now, apart from that, we should have uh, process Linux nodes updates, and similarly Windows Server node updates. So I'm writing these two as a separate point because each evening Linux nodes in AKS get security patches through their distro update channel. By default, it just happen at the back end. But this behavior is automatically configured as the nodes are deployed in an AKS cluster. You can't do anything, but it will not reboot your system. It will just update it. So you need to plan everything. We can talk about that. Then we have Windows Server nodes. It doesn't do automatically. Okay, but we should perform a node image upgrade operations to safely cordon and drain pods and deploy updated nodes, just like we do the deployment in AKS. It is like a deployment of on the node when you're changing the image. So these are some best practices to make our environment secure or AKS cluster secure. There could be many more, but for this video aspect, we are bringing only these point as a cluster security. Okay. We will dig deeper into other security aspect on it. So for that, I should write here as security hashtag one. Okay, it's a security one. We may have multiple videos on the security. So as I said, we are going to dig deeper on these points. These are all the points that we should be talking about. But first, let's start with this one. Enable threat protection or MS Defender for containers. All right, so let me take this here. This is what we are going to talk about. So MS Defender for containers offers a comprehensive suite of security features designed to protect AKS environments and extend security across multi-cloud and on-premises setups. So this is the feature of Defender. We can't do anything. We shouldn't, because it's a nice feature. But this has nothing to do with the AKS. This is the feature of Defender. Defender goes and secures your other cloud resources, your on-premises setups as well. Similarly, it is going to do for the containers. So let's quickly see this Defender for containers helps or addresses four core domains of container security. And what are those domains? Let's see. The very first is security posture management. Okay, this is the first domain. All right. Then we have another domain which is vulnerability assessment. Vulnerability assessment. Then we have another domain which is runtime threat protection. Okay. And there is one more which is deployment and monitoring. We can write it here or here, doesn't matter. Fourth point is deployment and monitoring. So it has these four domains where this provide security to our AKS cluster. And what we're going to do now, we're going to explore each one of these one by one so that we have a better understanding. So let's start with mm, security posture management. Okay. So what do we have here in the security posture management? Well, as we all know, this is the basic or the first or the one of the feature of Microsoft Defender is security posture management. It also protects the workload. That is another feature, but the first one is security posture management. So security posture management falls under this. And what comes under this? How it helps? Well, this ensure that your Kubernetes cluster nodes and workloads adhere to the best practices and security standards. So what is that? Well, we know how MS Defender recommendation works, right? Recommendation works. How it works, there is a policy that we apply, and as per the policy, once the policy runs, it will share the recommendations. Now, here in the case of AKS cluster, it will share the recommendation to secure the cluster or adhere to the best practices and the security standards. Same logic applies here. Then what it will do, and it will automatically review the cluster configurations. Okay, and compare them against the policy that we have applied. And what is that policy? That could be any benchmark that we supposed to follow, like CIS Kubernetes benchmark, uh, and it will match, compare, and provide the recommendation. So we can write here as a CIS Kubernetes industry benchmark policies. That's how it works, just like any other MS Defender recommendations, right? It also helps maintain the compliance because those policy will give you what needs to be applied or implemented or change or modify so that it can meet all those conditions which are there in the uh, policy. So it can also help in compliance tracking. Okay. Now we can take a simple example just to understand it better. For example, Defender for containers can scan your AKS cluster to ensure that RBAC or role-based access control is properly configured and no roles grant unnecessary broad permissions, which could expose the cluster to potential breaches. So one of that condition is there. It will scan and it will give you the recommendation and help you secure your cluster. So this is what the security posture management in a very small nutshell. Now, the another one is vulnerability assessment that we need to understand. So, what is vulnerability assessment? Just like any other vulnerability assessment it performs, it is the same thing. Vulnerability assessment. It identify and remediate vulnerabilities within container images and running containers, ensure they do not become entry points for attackers. So that's what it is. I should make a point here so that it will help us learn. It will identify, okay, I should make it black. Identify and remediate vulnerabilities. Where? In a container. It could be image or it could be running. So container images or containers. Ensure they do not become any issue or already attacked or entry point for the attackers. So that's what they do. As I said, as any other vulnerability thing, that's what they do. They're gonna check the vulnerabilities in their uh, container because that's the MS Defender for container. So how can they do it? They can do through image scanning. Yes, they can. They have to perform the scan. Only then they can tell you whether it is vulnerable or not, whether it is updated or not. So it is scan container images and registries before deployment and continuously monitors them for newly discovered vulnerabilities as well, right? Because you may running the old image, the base image is updated, things like that. So it continuously monitors that as well. Then it can also do runtime protection. How? Well, it monitors running containers as well and nodes for vulnerabilities that might have been missed during the initial scans or that emerge due to changes in the threat landscape. So not only containers, but also the nodes. Not only images, but also the running images. That means containers. All right. So we can take a little example here just to understand. Let's say before deploying a new application, Defender for Containers scan the Docker image for known vulnerabilities, such as those in outdated libraries or in insecure software configurations. If vulnerabilities are found, it provides recommendations for remediation, such as updating a library to a newer or patched version. Right? Simple? Good. Now, the third point is runtime threat protection. Okay, let me highlight it. That's what we are going to learn. Runtime threat protection. So what it is going to do now? Well, it will detect and respond to threats in real time as they occur within running containers and nodes. It's a threat protection. So that's what it's gonna do. It will detect and respond to threats in real time. In real time. That is the beauty. Because we don't want to respond once everything is ruined. We want to respond then and there when the thing is happening, right? So real time within a running containers and nodes. So it will do how it can achieve this by performing behavior monitoring. Yes, it utilizes behavioral analytics to detect unusual activities that may indicate a threat, such as unexpected network connections or process attempting to escalate privileges. So it will monitor those behavior. That means it can detect and simultaneously react or respond. Then it can also do the automated responses because once the detection is done, uh, it can respond as well. How? Automatically. Because uh, we have those actions there. It can take actions to mitigate threats, such as isolating a compromised container or triggering alerts, sending notifications to the responsible teams. Let's suppose if an attacker manages to exploit a running container and tries to connect to an external command and control server, Defender for Containers detect these unusual network activity and can automatically block the connection and alert the respective team or security administrators, right? So that's what the runtime threat protection is. Now we have, last but not least, deployment and monitoring. Okay, so what it does, as the name says, facilitate the secure deployment of containerized applications and provide continuous monitoring of the security health of container environment. So we can write here secure deployment of containerized application and provide continuous monitoring, right? So how? Because we can integrate this with CI/CD pipelines to ensure that only secure and compliant containers images are deployed. So secure deployment practices on container application, and of course continuous monitoring. Continuous monitoring, we can also write continuous monitoring because it offers dashboard and alerts that provide visibility into security status of containerized assets, helping teams to quickly detect and respond to security issues. With a simple example, like integration with Azure DevOps ensures that every new container build is scanned for vulnerabilities and compliance issues before it is allowed to be deployed to production. Once deployed, continuous monitoring checks for any runtime anomalies or changes that might affect the security posture, providing ongoing visibility and control. So that's what it does. So all these four things is done by Microsoft Defender for containers. These four things. That's how it helps. This is the very first point. We still need to go through all these points. We have only learned the first point, which is MS Defender for container. It provides, it helps in these four domains: provide posture management through policies, vulnerability assessment, runtime threat protection, and the deployment and monitoring, which is very important. So we can conclude this video by saying like MS Defender for containers provides an all encompassing approach to securing containerized environment by addressing critical aspect of container security, from ensuring robust security configurations and compliance to proactive vulnerability assessments, real-time threat detections, and secure deployment practices. By integrating these capabilities, organizations can protect their containerized application and infrastructures from emerging threats, reduce the attack surface, and ensure operational resilience. This holistic security strategy is crucial for business leveraging Kubernetes and container technologies across multi-cloud and on-premises environment. So I think that's all about it. AKS security, securing cluster, security video number one. There are so many points which are not like all the points. Will be coming up with so many other points as well from the different aspect of the AKS. These are specific to the cluster, and we'll be covering all of those. We may need to create multiple videos for the Azure AKS security, and we should, because security is a very important aspect of any environment. I hope it was informative and helpful. Thank you for watching, and you guys have a wonderful day. Bye bye.